bless his name. You ought to be tapping on the glass right now and blessing his name. It's so great to be here as we're in the second Sunday of 2021. Time stops for no one, does it? It just keeps moving and moving. And on last week, we started a new series, Forward Focus Movement. And last week we talked about moving from doom to destiny. And I gave you a bottom line is that you change your destiny by changing your destination. And that's good news. So let's say we all got our business fixed on last week and we got destiny figured out, right? That's good. We got destiny figured out. We know how it's going to end. But what do we do between now and then? That's where the struggle is, isn't it? And as believers, we sometimes think that once we got our destiny taken care of, that the struggle is over. But we as believers face the same struggles as the rest of the world. We have economic challenges, we have relationship challenges, we have all kinds of challenges. And so how do we make it from struggle to surplus? How do we get there? In fact, if you just look back 12 months ago, it just seems like an eternity. The United States economy was considered at its peak. It seemed like everybody had at least one job. Some folks had two, right? And we were considered at what you consider full employment. People just were supposedly making money hand over fist. And then in March, the pandemic hit, and we had national lockdowns and unemployment. I believe they said went as far as from 15 to 20% of people were unemployed. And that really wreaked havoc on people's lives. And now I think I heard the report on last week. I believe it's down to around 6.7%, and that's considered a new norm. But based on the latest news with the virus now running rampant again, looking at more shutdowns, those unemployment numbers could easily start going back up. So here we are, faced with struggle to surplus. But I was looking at an article, and some of y'all can fact check me on this, in the Washington Post and a couple of other sources. And this is some pre-pandemic information I want to share with you to show you why everything isn't as good as it always looks. Pre-pandemic, the article stated that between 50 to 78% of people were living from paycheck to paycheck. Did you hear that? Even with all that they were making. This is why the lockdowns were so devastating, because folks couldn't afford for the cash to stop flowing. Now, as long as it was flowing, they could make it from paycheck to paycheck. But when the pandemic hit, that paycheck stopped. 50 to 78% of people didn't have any savings. In fact, one of the reports I found said that 3 out of 10 people don't have sufficient savings. In fact, they said 40% of people don't have enough cash on hand. Listen to this. This is pre-pandemic now, before the pandemic. Did not have enough cash or savings to pay a $400 emergency. So that means most folks are struggling. Most folks are struggling. So how do we move from struggling to surplus? And I wish this kind of economic upheaval was a new norm. But as you look through the annals of history, you'll find that there's always periods of prosperity and wealth and poverty and welfare. Prosperity and wealth, poverty and welfare. And we're in one of those cycles right now where we see it at such a devastating amount. But I want you to look at a historical account found in the book of 2 Kings. If you would, if you've got your electronic devices, I pray that you pull down our church app. You can keep up with everything we're doing on there. You can give, you can join growth groups. In fact, it tells you about, I believe we've got the COVID testing this coming Wednesday, free right here at our church campus. You can find that on the app, and you can also follow me on Twitter there as well. But what I want you to do now, I want you to go down to the bottom of our app and press the button Worship, then hit Sermon Notes, and then click on January the 10th. And there you'll find our lesson text for today. It's 2 Kings chapter 4. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 7, but I only want to start with verses 1 through 5. And I'll come from the NIV. And here we find these words. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elijah, my husband, my husband is dead. Listen to what she says now. And you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my boys as his slaves. Elijah replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Listen to what she says. Your servant has nothing in the house, nothing there at all, except, I want you to draw a line up under there, a small jar of oil. Y'all with me that far? Now listen to what Elijah says in verse number 3. Elijah says, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for a few. This is what he says now. Don't ask for a few. What does he say next? Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil in the jars as each is filled, right? As each is filled, put it to one side. Verse number 5, I believe it says, she left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought her the jars, and she kept pouring. Now, to appreciate this text, I need to put it in this historical context to let you know that this is a real story about real people dealing with real life. This is a woman who is struggling. This is happening about 850-ish or so BC, maybe 830, 840, 850, somewhere along in there BC. That means before Christ was born. David has lived, for those of you biblical scholars. Solomon has already lived and died. So this is about 200 years or so after David had lived. And here they are now. Jehoram is the king of what we call the northern kingdom. Just a little background here now. The kingdom of Israel has split, sort of like the United States had the north and the south. Y'all remember that? And there was civil unrest, right, in America. So this is, again, nothing new. They had the same kind of civil religious unrest between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. This story is taking place in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is the 10 tribes of Israel who has sort of left God and was following the way of the world. Their economic hopes and their political process was following the world's process, and their government was being run like the world's government, and they were worshiping all kinds of gods and things of that nature. And Jehoram, to know who he is the son of King Ahab. Now that may not mean much to many of you, but most of you would know his mama, Jezebel. Yeah. Now, most folks may not know King Ahab, but most folks know the name Jezebel, right? In fact, do you know the people who name their children Jezebel? I don't think it's a name most folks use. That shows you how bad she was. They wouldn't even name their children after her. She would kill preachers. Let me just make it that plain. She had, if you didn't do what she wanted, she would have you taken out. She's a bad girl. Her husband was crying one day about a piece of property he wanted. And she said, boy, get off the bed, you the king. And she went out and killed a man and took his property because her husband wanted it. That's how bad she was. Now, this is this boy's mama, all right, in which this young lady is living up under his rule at this time. And so he would make, can I just talk plain? He would make Donald Trump look like a Boy Scout. All right, this is how bad they were at this time. And so the economic situation was so bad that even a woman whose husband was a preacher, look at this now. See, so we see that we aren't exempt. Her husband was a preacher and he died penniless. Why? Because he was living in a country that didn't recognize God, and they didn't have anything to do with a preacher. So I can imagine the boy probably didn't make much, all right, because he was living in a godless society. So watch this now. Being faithful has nothing to do with your economic position. All right. Oftentimes, so this is one of these name it and claim it. Oftentimes we believe if I believe hard enough and if I worship hard enough, everything ought to be going all right. Is that not true? We just figured it ought to just roll on in, right? I'm trusting God. I'm doing everything that God would have me to do. Go back and look at the text. What did the woman say? Your servant, my husband, is dead. Your servant, she's talking to the prophet Elisha, and she even calls herself a servant. So it means that they were being faithful, that they loved the Lord. So there's nothing that says automatically in your loving God that everything's going to be all right, that everything's going to always go well. And so here she was faced with an economic challenge. Look at her challenge now. She says her husband is dead. That's one bad thing for a woman during that period of time. She was dependent upon her husband because it was an agrarian society. They worked the land. They needed all the resources that the husband could manifest to support the household. And here she says, she goes to the preacher and says, preacher, your deacon, your minister is dead. My husband, who has done a very good job for you. He was there Sunday in and Sunday out. Every day that door opened, he was there serving. He revered the Lord. That means he worshiped the Lord in spirit and in truth. Are y'all walking with me here? All right, and then this is important for us because in difficult times, we sometimes wonder, has God left us? He sometimes put us in the same situation he puts everyone else to see how we're going to respond. So now look, not only is her husband dead, next it says, and his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. Now let's just pause here for a second. I just need to have a little sidebar here because some of us will get down on the creditor. Man, that's low. The woman's husband just died, and here he is coming right now. He's probably right there at the end of the funeral coming for these 2 boys. That just sound low. Doesn't that sound? Y'all would talk about that creditor like a dog. That he has no respect for the dead. You know, something we would say, he has no respect for the dead. Well, watch this, 2 things. Creditors have creditors too. They owe folks too. All right? And sometimes we get upset with the creditor for their wanting their money. Well, you borrowed it from them, right? Just because you're on hard times doesn't mean they're not on hard times. So don't knock the creditor. In fact, it was his right. All right. In fact, when loved ones die, what does the state of North Carolina or wherever you are require a creditor to do? Post notice, right? And the one who posts first gets it first, right? They get in line. This brother said, I'm getting in line first. All right. He's staking his claim. And in those days, watch this now, this is showing you how the religious society of the northern kingdom had broken down. In those days, the law allowed for the 2 boys to be taken to work off the debt. All right? Now, had they been living by a Jewish law and following biblical principles, there was a way out of that. But because they had decided to live according to the lay of the land, they got to suffer the consequences. Are y'all walking with me that far? So now, here she is. She's in a bad way. Husband's dead. A creditor's coming. She's got past due bills. That sounds like 2021, doesn't it? Huh? You see, this is, I'm telling you, when you study the text, it's modern day. Some of you sitting out there said, that sounds like you. Yeah, you right there in the scriptures. This is real. She's up against it. She's facing it right now. And here's the backdrop. She loves the Lord. he loves the Lord, or he loved the Lord. Wow. So let me give you your first focal point here. Our circumstances may be beyond our control, but how we respond is our choice. All right? Our circumstances, her circumstances, were beyond her control. And let's not beat up on the brother. Some would say, well, he shouldn't have been in all of that debt. In that day and time, he may have been doing all he could just to make ends meet. All right, and so we're not going to go down that trail. This doesn't say he was a poor money manager. It says he loved the Lord. So he was doing the best he could with what he had. And then life happened. I'm quite certain he hadn't planned to die then. I'm quite certain. Now, he thought he had a pretty good financial plan. In those days, what was the financial plan? Have some boys, to have at least one. He had two. So he felt pretty good that even if life came, she should be okay. But his debt exceeded his assets. So he was what? Bankrupt. Am I talking to anybody other than just a few folks? Do you hear me? Do you hear me loud and clear? Notice now, this has nothing to do with your faith, but everything to do with your faith. Watch it. It's going to go both ways. Both ways. Circumstances has nothing to do with your faith. How you respond has everything to do with your faith. Circumstances has nothing to do with your faith. How you respond has everything to do with your faith. I told you it was going to cut both ways, didn't I? Walk with me here now. Notice what he says next now. Elijah said, how can I help you? Now, in the Hebrew, what he's really saying, what you expect me to do? Brother said, you expect me to change the law? I can't fix this for you. I'm just a preacher. I can't change the government's regulations. But then he paused for a moment. And he says, tell me what you have in your house. Tell me what you got. Notice what she says, your servant has nothing there at all. She said, isn't that what the text says? But then she says, except a small jar of oil. Now, notice what Elijah tells her to do. Elijah says, now here's what I want you to do. I want you to go around the neighborhood. Ask everybody for some empty jars. Just go door knocking. Go knock on your neighbor's door. Go on out there right now. Knock on doors. And ask your neighbors for some jars. Now, first off, right off the bat, most of y'all not going to leave the house. Because that don't make a bit of sense. I told you how much I have. I've got a small jar of oil, right? Now, I tell you how you respond to your circumstances says something about your faith. You can't change your circumstances, but how you respond. Now, here are the instructions, plain as day. Listen to it now. Go around, knock on your neighbor's door, and ask them for some empty jars. And when they give them to you, pretty much is what he's saying. He said, take them home, right? Put the jars, take that little bit of oil you have, and start pouring it in there. But he told her to do something else first. What did he say? Shut the door behind you. Write this verse down. You can read it later. Matthew, I believe it's Matthew 6:6. And it talks about when you pray, go into your prayer closet. See, there's some things God wants to do in private, but he's going to make it public. Are y'all walking with me here? Sometimes he has to get you by yourself so you can see yourself and understand what you need from the God of the universe. And so he's saying now, go inside the house, close the door behind you and your son, pour oil in the jars, and as each one is filled, set it aside. Now, let's just talk plain. Now, this is historical. Now, this is real. This isn't a fairy tale. This actually happened. There's historical record here. That just doesn't sound logical. Let's just be honest. Come on. Somebody tap on the glass. Put something in the chat box and say that's real. Talk to me there a little bit. Let me know what you think about that. How many of you would just do that? I'm going to tell you right now. You just got a little bit of oil. Now, let's talk about this olive oil. Because there are a lot of things that olive oil was used for during that time. Of course, the priests used it for anointing. All right? But in day-to-day living, it was used for heating and cooking. All right, so people had to have it. It was a necessity. It was a commodity. It was something that everybody has to have every day, sort of like modern day electricity. All right, because they trim their lamps with it. All right, so you can have all of those kinds of things. And so here you are now. He's telling you to go to these different places and ask your neighbors for some jars, and for you to go home and close the door, and then start pouring oil out of this little jar into these other jars. Well, but you're struggling now. You're struggling, right? Most of you say, well, let me just go on over here to the bank and see if I can get a loan. Right? Because this doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. But notice what she says next. Notice what the text says next. She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. Yeah, y'all missed it right there. She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. She did exactly, it didn't say she called her girlfriends, it didn't say she put it out on Facebook, it didn't say she tweeted nobody, it didn't say she went and asked anybody else for some other advice. Are you looking at the text there? Her response now, she had many things that she could do at that moment once she got those instructions. It's the same way with all of us. When we get biblical and sound instruction, we have a choice to make. We can either accept what God says, or we can say, you know what, that doesn't make sense. And we can do something else. She had a choice. She had a choice. But sister went in and she brought the jars. Her sons brought the jars. That means they went out and got them. And it says, look what she says. She kept pouring. Now, here's the second focal point that I don't want you to miss out on. Don't want you to miss this one at all. We have an active part to play in our struggle. Oh, y'all didn't hear me. We have an active part. Do you know some folks who just sitting at home waiting for the Lord to bless them? God's going to bless me. And he told me to wait on the Lord. And I'm just going to wait on him. Well, a little sidebar. The Hebrew word wait means doing what you're supposed to do his way while you are waiting. But we have an active part. Her first active part was she acted in faith. She went home, shut the door, and kept pouring. That was her active part. She activated her faith. Some of us need to hit the activation button on our faith. We know what we're supposed to do. We understand what we're supposed to do, but we haven't hit the activation button. We don't act on it because God asks us to do some foolish things. He does. Now, and this message isn't just about money. This is just an example of how God can work in this particular situation here. But God asks us to do some things that just don't seem right. Like, love your enemy. Be kind to those who will despitefully use you. Use you. Be kind to them. That just doesn't sound right when you're living in a secular economy of life. But see, we who call ourselves followers of Jesus, we have another home. In fact, this isn't our home. We're foreigners here. We're supposed to obey what our king says. We don't have to worry about the outcome of elections because our king is always on the throne. His guidelines, we don't have to worry about changes in policies and procedures because his policies and procedures have already been written and they've already been written down. Oh, y'all not listening to me. So we have to hit the activation button. Are we going to believe what our king says to do? Walk with me further now. Let's look at verses, I think I didn't give you these. Let's look at verses 6 and 7 now. And now this is where you're going to need your Bibles. Go back to your Bibles now and look what happens here in verses 6 and 7. Look what it says. It says, when all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. Are y'all with me? But he replied, there is not a jar left. Then the oil stopped flowing. Let's stop right there for a minute. Let's just stop. Let's just pause right there for a minute. I don't know if y'all saw what happened right there. Notice now. Notice. The jars were being filled. When did the oil stop? Did the oil stop before the jars stopped, or did the oil stop after the jars stopped? Come on, huh? When did it stop? Notice now, the blessing wasn't limited by God. We limit the blessing. Remember what he said? He said, don't go out and get a few. He says, go out and get as many as you possibly can. He says, don't skimp. When God tells you to do something, he says what? He can open up the windows of heaven and pour you out blessing that you don't have room to store. If she'd had more jars, the oil would not have stopped flowing. Are y'all looking at this? From struggle to surplus. Now notice, remember I told you circumstances, the economy there was downward. It wasn't a good economy. Things were rough. Go back and read chapters 1 through 3. That's your reading assignment. And see how bad the economy was at the time this was happening. You see, this was in an economic downturn. Now, let's look at verse 7. Let's look at verse 7. Because I got some things I've got to share with you here. Look what verse 7 says. She went and told the man of God. No, she went on Twitter. She went on Facebook. No, it says she went and told the man of God, and he says, go sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your son can live off what is left. Now, stop. First thing, notice now, she went and gave the praise and honor to the Lord. She praised God. She went to him first and told him what God had done. What God had done is what God said he would do. Notice what it says next. And he said, go sell the oil and pay your debt. He could have stopped right there. Because when you go back and look at verses 1 and 2, when she came to him, the only thing she was after was her debts being paid and her sons being saved. That's all she wants. But look what God does. God goes beyond what we stand in need of. Notice it says, go pay your debt. Right? Is that not good news for most of us? How many of you just be glad to pay your debt? Go and knock on the glass. You just be glad to pay your debt. But God don't want you just living with just debt paid. Notice what it says. You and your son can live on what's left. Guess what? He put her in the oil business. The sister is in the oil business now. He gave us some money to have something left. This is the first person in the Bible in the oil business. Read your scriptures. Don't look at your text. God says now, the text says, you and live what is left. Now, according to how that Hebrew passage is structured, she could have lived quite a long time with what was left over. She had an abundance. God gave her more in a situation when there was less. Why? Because she was faithful in an unfaithful land. When people weren't trusting God, go back to the beginning of the text. It says, your servant, my husband, is dead. You know how he revered the Lord. But go back when Elijah asked her, she says, your servant. What is she saying? I'm still serving the Lord. She says, I'm putting my hand in the master's hand. I'm going to continue to trust him in good times and in bad times. Why? Because it's God who can move you from struggle to surplus. Oh, he didn't just meet the need. He gave a surplus. He gave her more than she needed, so she could have more than enough. Isn't that good news? More than enough. Now, what am I saying here? As I said earlier, this isn't just about how God can act in your finances. God can show up in the same way in any area of your life. Your struggle may be with loneliness. God can take you from struggling to surplus, and how to have godly relationships. Some of us are lonely in multiple relationships. Say amen, lights, knock on the glass at home. It could be in your employment. You're struggling with the job you might be making good money, but you're not being satisfied in the work that you're doing. You're struggling. He can take you from struggle to surplus. What area is it? Some of us are so busy that we're struggling in just managing our time. But God, you want some more time. You can go from struggle to surplus. Some of us have rebellious children that you're struggling with. And you're wondering, how can you get them out of this kind of rebellious cycle? You spend time with God, He can take you from struggling with your children to surplus time with your children. Let me just give you, there's 4 things I want you to remember as we move from struggling to surplus. And let me give you your last focal point here first. God has the power to show us His ability even when we're stuck. Isn't that good news? I really should say even when we think we're stuck. Or even stuck. God has the power to show us His ability. He's not trapped by circumstances. That ought to be good news. So let me give you 4 ways, 4 steps to move from struggling to surplus. Here's the first one. You got to start right here. You have to face desperate circumstances with forward-focused faith, not fear. Did you hear what I said? Forward-focused faith. You got to be trusting God in your circumstances, despite how desperate they are. You got to have forward-focused faith, not fear. Here's the second thing, and this is a difficult one. You got to be open and honest with yourself about your circumstances. Notice, go back to the text. The woman was open and honest. She said that her sons were about to be taken. Her husband was dead, right? She just laid it straight out there. A lot of times we like to sugarcoat our situation. We like to try to justify why it is like it is. No, be open and honest with yourself first. Look yourself in the mirror and say, self, we got a problem. She had a problem. And she was open and honest with herself. Now, the third thing, after you're open and honest with yourself, here's where the rubber meets the road. Seek godly counsel for direction. Here's the key thing now, and be open and honest with your counselor about your situation. This is the sad part. We often seek biblical counsel or godly counsel, but one, we aren't open and honest. We don't. We don't tell them the whole truth. We tell them what we think we want to hear because of shame or guilt or whatever reason. 2, sometimes we don't seek godly counsel. We go everywhere else. We look at all other sources. I told you where this lady was during the time this happened. Most people weren't looking to God for answers. That's why they were in the shape they're in. Right now, many people are still looking, waiting for the government bailout to come, waiting for some other remedy to come. Seek godly counsel, whether it's emotional, mental health, physical health, spiritual direction. Let me give you the 4th one. And here's where the rubber meets the road. Trust and obey biblically sound instructions, even when they seem unorthodox. Notice what he asked her to do. He told her to go ask her neighbors for some jars. That wasn't uncommon in the Jewish culture. So what he asked her to do wasn't uncommon for her to do. The key thing was she too prideful to go do it? And then not only trust it, it's to obey it. Follow it to the letter. There are many things that God tells us to do: how to manage our money, how to manage our time, how to manage our body, how to manage your day, how just to manage. Follow those biblical instructions, even when they seem unorthodox, even when the world says it's okay to do it another way. So what do I want you to learn from this if you don't learn anything else? Here's what I want you to learn. God can move you from struggling to surplus under any circumstances. Under any circumstance. Now, the key element there is that you have to trust him now. God can move you from struggling to surplus under, put a line up under that, any circumstances. The economy, pandemic, racial, social, political unrest, none of that impacts who God is. He can take care of you, just like he did this widow here. Notice she's unnamed. This shows you that how specific God gets. Her husband was just one of many in a company of prophets. So you don't have to be some well-known person for God to know you well. Let me say that again. You don't have to be a well-known person for God to know you well. And because he knows us each by name, he cares for us. He's a loving and compassionate and kind God. And he wants to move you from struggling to surplus. But it's going to require that you have some forward-focused faith. Now, this works for us as believers. If you're not a believer in Jesus Christ, then Minister to be Jeff Dickens is going to come and show you how you can move from struggling to surplus in your relationship with Jesus Christ. God bless you, and I pray I'll see you this week. And don't forget the COVID testing this week here on campus. God bless you, and see you next week.